What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 115 of the Book Binge, where this week we're doing a special review for another item that releases very soon after this comes out, next week in fact. This is the next novella in the Sun Eater saga by Christopher Ruocchio, titled The Dregs of Empire. This is the Lorien novella that has been advertised for the last several months, a story that was actually plotted a couple of years ago, shortly after Christopher wrote Kingdoms of Death, back when Kingdoms of Death was the combination of Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man, before the split. So this one has been kind of on the back burner for a couple years, not until, after he finished getting those two books split, but also after writing Disquiet Gods. He finally wrote this earlier this year. But before I continue on and actually review the story, I do want to give off a little bit of a disclaimer. I did have the opportunity and got the offer from Anderida Books through Ruocchio so that I could proofread the Dregs of Empire and other stories, the Anderida special edition that will be coming out, I think just a little bit later than this. By the time I'm recording this video, that announcement actually hasn't been made yet, so I don't know the date for sure. I just know that the date of the independent novella's release is a week from the day this video comes out. So the Anderida version of this collection with Dregs of Empire and Tales Volume 3 should be coming out pretty soon, within the month I would guess. And I actually read the story about a month ago by the time you're seeing this, because of this proofreading opportunity. Again, I'll say for the final time, this is available next week on November 7th. This book comes out. If you want to get it on ebook, you can pre-order it. The hardcover print-on-demand version doesn't have a pre-order because of the way that Amazon has stuff set up, but that will be available on November 7th as well. So I hope that you guys would pick this up, not just because, I had the opportunity to read it early, but because it's actually pretty dang good. And speaking of the good, let's talk about the good of the Dregs of Empire. Starting off, of course, with some very immediately noticeable things that I just loved about the story. First off, the setting. Volusia, fantastic setting for the story for many reasons, not just because of the story that's being told or because of the arc that Lorien has to go in and some of the other character stuff that's going on in the story, but just because I just really liked Volusia as a setting for the story. Like, it's very distinct, very identifiable, different from everything else in the series thus far. It's just incredible. I loved the setting of it. And just like I mentioned while talking about that involving Lorien's character arcs, if you love having a tangible character arc, seeing a character go through, a process of change and a process of, a story that's evolving them tangibly throughout the course of the story, this book is really great for that. You do get to see some changes in characters, partially because of the setting, but also because of the story itself. But like I said, the setting does have a lot to do with that. The character arcs in this book are actually surprisingly good, because it's something that I feel like has been somewhat missing to some degree from a lot of the series up to this point. I've always loved character reactions, or character interactions rather, just kind of the way that characters talk to each other, the way they interact with each other, the way that, their relationships unfold essentially throughout the main series. But a lot of what could be considered a character arc within Sun Eater, I feel like some of the most stark examples are ones that you don't notice quite so strongly until you reread them. For example, rereading the main series right now, I've gone through the first two books. The first time I read this series, I looked at younger Hadrian a lot different than I do now, because I'm now looking at it a lot more from the point of view of the Hadrian that is narrating the stories from, 1,500 years later, essentially. Well, later from the first book, but all things considered, the actual character arcs of the books are most notable or most noticeable on a reread. I mean, there are some characters. I mean, Basander Lin, for example, goes through some pretty great changes in the series, and you get to see that pretty tangibly. But a lot of the characters do have a lot of stuff that you don't notice until the reread. This is a story where you will notice some character changes very starkly, and they are done very intentionally to do so. And it's just something that I really appreciated about that. The story, also, speaking of Lorien and his character arc, being from Lorien's point of view specifically, allows for so many things to happen in it that otherwise couldn't if Lorien wasn't the POV character, and especially if Lorien wasn't in the story. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you get to see there. The pacing and the plotting of the Dregs of Empire is also fantastic. I would say even more than The Lesser Devil, which previously was a pretty, pretty high up there in terms of, ranking everything from the series, including side material. I really liked The Lesser Devil. The Lesser Devil was also a story that I found to be, to some degree, in some sense, the easiest or the most easily converted into a film, just kind of the way that it's paced and plotted. I would say the Dregs of Empire might arguably even be easier, or at the very least is a little bit more similar to a traditional film in terms of its pacing, and that's really cool as well. You kind of get to see a little bit of a different writing. Speaking of the writing, Ruoccio's prose, as always, is fantastic. There are some amazing lines in this story, some stingers that I just really adore. I'm obviously not going to give any away. There's one in particular that I think is better left, for some readers to discover, because I think there's a couple lines in here that might fly over some people's heads. There's just some great writing in the story, and the way that it is written also allows for Lorien's POV not just to be cool because of how Lorien is different from other characters within the universe. Lorien as a character is also written so distinctly within the story compared to everything else from the series. This is something that I also complimented about Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 3 when I reviewed that. The way that Ruocchio has really come into his own, and not just being able to write some really great stuff, but also be able to make it as if even just his normal writing is slightly different based off of the character he's writing. For example, one of the stories in Tales Volume 3 being from the POV of Octavia Corvo, feels very distinctly Octavia, even though we haven't read anything from her POV before that story. Same thing here with Lorien. We haven't read anything from Lorien's POV, but you can tell, like, this is Lorien in terms of the writing. Just the general narration, not even his internal thoughts. The narration itself feels like Lorien. So I really like that. I think Ruoccio's writing has gotten to be so amazing over the last few years that it's actually just insane. It actually makes me really excited to read Queen of Mid-Ashes, because Queen of Mid-Ashes, I think, was written after Ashes of Man, if I'm not mistaken. So it has, it was written during that era of, Ruoccio's really great prose, but was one that I didn't really connect to the first time that I read it. It's notably one of my least favorite, stories within the Sun Eater, but it's the next thing that I'm going to read as soon as I'm done here very soon with my reread of Tales Volume 3 for this proofreading endeavor for Inderida. I'm really excited to go back into Queen of Mid-Ashes and see how much different I feel, not just about the story, but about the writing, because I'll have read it, this second time in context with a lot of the more recent writing too. But all of that is getting a little bit too off track for this video. Let's talk about what could be considered the bad of the Dregs of Empire. Now, none of this, I think, is inherently a bad thing. Most of it's just kind of like a small warning, so to speak, for certain readers or certain people who might be a little bit sensitive to certain stuff. Well, with that being said, it's probably not going to be, that much of a problem, because this story, do not read it until after Ashes of Man. Like, absolutely do not read it until after Ashes of Man. Like, this is pretty similar thing for Tales Volume 3. One story in there spoils Kingdoms of Death. Another story in there spoils Ashes of Man. This story spoils both Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man, obviously. So, yeah, definitely go into this knowing that. And if you've made it through Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man, a lot of, some of this aspect is gonna, it's not going to be as much of a problem for you, because those are fairly dark books. Kingdoms of Death especially is a rather dismal read. This story is pretty dismal. It is probably it's arguably, I'll say it's arguably the darkest story in the Sun Eater up to this point, with Kingdoms of Death being the only real comparison in my mind immediately that I can come up with. It's pretty dreary, it's pretty dismal, and I mean, Ruocchio has said this himself a couple times already. It's literally space gulag. Like Volusia is the Empire's prison planet. it's been referenced in the series multiple times. Like, Belusia is the prison planet. That's where this story takes place. It's not an easy read for in terms of some of the material. Like I said, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that maybe some people might want to know going into it ahead of time. I mean, I don't know what exactly else you might be expecting from this literally being a space gulag story, but it is pretty dismal. There were some moments while I was reading this where I just had to up and say, like, this story is kind of a bummer, dude. Like, it is it is pretty rough in spots because of the content. The only other thing that I will note here as being potentially bad in any regard is the first half of the story I could see some people considering a little bit long-winded. But I think everything within the first half, despite, taking place over a large space of time and taking up a little bit of the runtime, so to speak, of the book, does serve the character arcs very, very well. And speaking of characters, I forgot to mention earlier in the side characters in this story are actually pretty good. There's a couple of them that I really, really like. But the character stuff that happens with this book, the real character exploration that Ruocchio is doing in the Dregs of Empire, specifically with Lorien, all of it is served by the material greatly in the first half, even if maybe in the moment a little bit of it might seem a little bit long-winded. It is the longest of the 3 novellas. It's basically a novel in its own right. In terms of word count, it is a novel in its own right. So calling it a novella is basically just like, cope. It's a coping mechanism because it is a novel. But I think it still serves the story very importantly. There is nothing in this that after having finished it, I would even consider cutting it. All of it is very, very important for the character arc. For the ugly, let me just ask you a question. Do you remember that scenario in Demon in White that Lorien was, sort of the linchpin of solving, that he refused to explain how he did it, refused to explain to Hadrian how it happened, the way that it happened, how it went down, what he did to make things work? You remember how everybody has been, kind of asking Ruocchio to tell that story somewhere, even though Ruocchio has said that he wasn't going to? Not once, but twice, Ruocchio teased the revelation of this scenario. And one of them was actually rather, let me see if I can find the lines. It was specific. This is a direct quote from the story. It's not spoiling anything. This is a line that he says one of the times when he teases this. The story was too wild to be believed anyway. I'm actually kind of mad that Ruocchio specifically did this. I think he did this to target me and everybody else who's been wanting him to explain the story. He's obviously not going to, but man, that was rude to do that. Not once, like I said, but twice. 2 times he did this. But for the recommendation, I will give this a huge recommend. Obviously, do not read until after Ashes of Man. And if you've gotten through Ashes of Man, you've obviously read Kingdoms of Death as well. So if you stomached those 2 books between Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man, you should be fine reading this. It is a classic butterflies and rainbows Sun Eater story. Nothing bad ever happens in Sun Eater, obviously. And referencing kind of what I was saying about the Dregs of Empire and other stories being the Anderida edition of how I got to read this story a little bit early. This is by far the best of the Anderida collections. It's Dregs is the best of the side novels / novellas so far, and Tales V3 is the best of the short story collections, which means that this collection is one that you should definitely pick yourself up a copy if you are able to. So that is my recommendation. Definitely check this out. I had a great time with the Dregs of Empire, even if it was pretty far from fun per se. But yeah, I definitely huge recommend. At this point, if you've read this much material from the Sun Eater enough to be able to read this story now, you're already committed to Ruocchio at this point. You've probably already made the decision that you're going to read it anyway, but that is the recommendation. But thank you guys for watching this video. I don't even know what's actually coming out on the channel next. I haven't planned out. At the time that I'm recording this, which is on the 1st of October, actually, even though this doesn't come out until the 31st, I actually haven't planned out any of my November video plans, so I have no clue what's coming out on the channel next. But I'm sure you'll figure it out here in 2 days when the next episode of the Book Binge comes out. Actually, that's a lie. This Thursday should be the first Wheel of Time diary for the Shadow Rising. I remembered that much. So if you're, curious to check that out, if you've been following along with my Wheel of Time reading, that will be coming out on Thursday. But thank you guys again for watching. I'll be back in the next video.